before I even saw any inmates in the yard, I knew something was wrong. And it was just kind of in the air. I could feel it. I just knew something was wrong.
The second thing that was so outstanding about Lou Clapp to me was the fact of the way he handled riots and disturbances out there. You have to move fast, and he did.
The inmates were dissatisfied. I think the administration really didn't see it coming, and it just ignited. It got interesting that night. And I used to take my tear gas gun and go down and sit in my cage down there and keep peace, you know.
There was enough of them there that knew that I maintained discipline and that no rioting would be permitted or somebody was going to be killed.
Welcome to Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the men and women who worked, lived, and served here at the old Idaho State Penitentiary. I'm here in the trenches with Anthony.
Hello.
And we're talking on the phone with Skye in Dallas.
Happy Stool Pigeon Saturday.
Yes, happy Stool Pigeon Saturday.
How's the weather been in Texas, Skye?
Oh my gosh, it's been a very rainy spring and thus a very humid spring. I did go mountain biking today. There are some trails around, but it was incredibly humid and it's supposed to rain this afternoon. But it has been in the 90s and it is, as of recording, only May 22nd. So how is the weather there? It's been looking very gorgeous from the insane amount of times I check the weather app.
You know, it's been pretty nice. It's been kind of off and on. We've had a little rain this morning, but for the most part, we've seen a lot of flowers blooming. All of the roses are in season in the prison. It's gorgeous here.
I always love that juxtaposition of the roses and the prison. I think so many visitors, don't you think that's a very common question that we get is, were these roses here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I love that people, I love that people are curious about that. And I love that we get to say yes, they were.
Speaking of gorgeous, of course, we're going to talk about one of the most beautiful places on earth, arguably. This is kind of a special stool pigeon because we're going to head over to Sun Valley and Skye is going to tell us about what she's been working on for many years now.
Surprise to guests, not only do you get to hear me in the regular ones, you also get to hear me on Saturdays. Sorry, not sorry about it. But no, Anthony and Sam, were kind enough to sort of humor me to allow me to make this episode to tell you really what I've been working on. We started the podcast the same year that I started my PhD program. And so it is absolutely insane to me that we've been doing the podcast for 5 years and I've been working on it the entire time I've been working on my PhD program. Especially for the last 2 years, I've been working really intensively on my dissertation research and writing, and I am now done. Yes, the rumors are true. I am a doctor, but only call for me air horn.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But only call for me on an airplane if you have questions about late 19th or early 20th century America with an emphasis on early Hollywood. If it's a medical emergency, do not call on me. I will say I am not a doctor. So yes, I'm now graduated and now I have this dissertation. And in this dissertation, I focus a big chunk of it actually on Sun Valley. And so for 2 months in the fall of 2022, I visited the community library in Ketchum, Idaho, just a few miles away from the Sun Valley Ski Resort. It is an absolutely beautiful library. I'm sure I mentioned it if we recorded while I was working there. I honestly can't remember. A great library, has any resources you might want to know about Sun Valley, obviously. I mean, also just a beautiful, beautiful part of the state. And so while I was there at the community library, I researched not just the history of Sun Valley, but more specifically, I studied the actions and behavior of celebrity women at Sun Valley between 1936 and 1945. And I'll get a little bit more into this, obviously, as it goes on. And so I can talk about my other chapters in other episodes if we want, but as I said today, I'll focus on the Sun Valley section. And so first I'll kind of give you a roadmap of what today's episode will look like, because it is just me talking. It isn't necessarily a typical subject for our podcast, but as I said, I do want to share my work because it's related to Idaho, and as we all know, I love Idaho.
Yeah.
I'll just give you sort of a quick overview about my dissertation. I'll start with a really interesting story about an important Sun Valley skier. This will then lead us into the history of Sun Valley. Then we'll get into sort of the meat of my argument, where I talk most about the influence and presence of celebrity women at Sun Valley at the height of Hollywood's golden age. And then lastly, I want to end with a brief discussion about sort of quote-unquote golden age movies that are set in Sun Valley in the 1940s and in the 1950s. The films were made in that time. And this discussion of movies is another section I have of my dissertation. Again, happy to talk about all of this if anyone is interested. I don't want to bore too many people, but Sun Valley, at least, is very exciting. I hope a lot of our listeners have been there. If not, I highly encourage people to go, and hopefully this episode will get you excited about that. And Anthony and Sam, if at any point it doesn't make sense or you have questions about anything, please let me know. I'm happy to elaborate on anything to talk about Sun Valley as long as we want, because I could talk about it all day long.
Skye, I'm so excited. There is nothing quite like this strange little part of Idaho that celebrities and locals and everyone just seems to flock to.
Yeah, and even like today as this mecca and meeting point of, the world's richest and most famous people in little Idaho, this strange little central point in Idaho. Yeah, I love it.
And actually, I can tell you kind of the impetus of how I came up with this idea. It was actually Amber Byerly, who was our previous historic sites administrator. Now Anthony is. Amber's the one who hired me, and I really, learned a lot under her. And I started going to school while she was still there. And she asked, it was in the summer between my first and my second year. And I was working at the pen for the summer. And she said, so how long is your program? And I said, oh, it's about 5 years. And she was like, dang, that's a really long time. And I was like, I know. She said, it's too bad you can't come back and study something in Idaho, like Sun Valley or something. And I was like,
nice.
Oh, but I absolutely can't. Like, I can do that. And so that idea really percolated in the back of my mind. And then there were, and I'll explain this a little bit more. There were two other sites. My dissertation looks at sort of historic sites, places. And there were two other sites that I had sort of already known about in my own personal study and stuff. When I realized how my sites lined up chronologically and how much Sun Valley has, how much it always has had this celebrity influence like you guys are talking about, I was like, there's no way I can't include this. So this actually is a really good transition to kind of take us into this overview of my dissertation. And so my larger argument, is that between roughly 1920 and 1950, the behavior of celebrity women may have encouraged American women to act in ways that challenged the limited role that women usually had in American public society. So in other words, many social and cultural leaders expected women to stay in the home rather than to be out in public doing things, especially like sports or working, things like this. Mm-hmm. I then further argue that even as celebrity women are behaving at these places in ways that maybe challenged women's relegation or, being forced back into the home, fan magazines actually increasingly promote the idea that women should be in home, especially by the 1940s. So a couple things to explain here. What I mean by fan magazines, in current day, they're things like People or Us Weekly, those things you walk by, at the grocery store, where that they have the photos and the stories about, famous women or famous people generally. Back then, there were actually a lot. Fan magazines and movie fan culture was huge in the 1920s through the 40s. There are lots of them. The main ones I study are Photoplay, Motion Picture Magazine, Movieland, Screenland, Silver Screen, Picture Play. All of these fan magazines are mentioning all of these places that I talk about in my dissertation and how celebrity women are behaving there, and that includes Sun Valley. So Sun Valley is being talked about a lot in these fan magazines. The three places that I study are all in the American West, and they're where celebrity women spent a lot of time, and again, where their activities were regularly publicized. Two of them are in Los Angeles, the Hollywood Studio Club, and the Hollywood Studio Club is a really interesting little place. Happy to talk about this later too, but it was a boarding house for women who were interested in the film industry. It was owned by the YWCA. Women who wanted to get famous, become actresses or singers. There were a couple animators. They could go live at the Studio Club that had connections to people in Hollywood. Really interesting place. The other Los Angeles site I look at is called the Hollywood Canteen. It was a place during World War II where soldiers who were on leave in Los Angeles could come. They could get food and drinks for free. They could dance with movie stars. Movie stars were the staff of this canteen. So that's, again, also a very interesting place. And of course, the third is Sun Valley. So some of you might know all this history about Sun Valley. If you're a native Idahoan, maybe you go to Sun Valley to ski in the winter a lot. Maybe you go in the summer just to be in the beautiful weather, but maybe you don't know all of this. And so if you're wondering why in the world is Sun Valley included in this study that's looking at these other two places in Los Angeles, then obviously this is the episode for you. Actually, before we do, in order to set up Sun Valley, we have to go first back to 1948. It's the first Winter Olympics after World War II, and they're being held in St. Moritz, Switzerland. So the American women's ski team arrives in St. Moritz without a coach and with few expectations of performing well against the European women who had dominated the ski circuit for years. Two male ski legends had coached and were coaching men's team, but the women's team had no coach at all. In fact, the only advice that these women were given leading up to the games was to get physically fit during the summer and not to wear high heels so that they didn't stretch out their Achilles tendons. So for a while, the women's team tried to get different men's team members to coach them, but every man all gave them different advice, and so they were really having a hard time finding this cohesive identity for their team. Eventually they hired a Swiss slalom specialist who at least nominally coached the women's team, but it really kind of seems that these women were on their own. Journalist Peter Pringsheim wrote in a Ski Illustrated magazine that there was, quote, little doubt that a stronger American women's team has ever been sent to Olympic competition, end quote. But even with that, the press hardly expected the American women to perform well enough to mention in any of their publications. And so when someone asked if the press wanted to interview any members of the women's team, another journalist said, quote, oh, if someone breaks a leg, let us know and we'll send that home, end quote. So the 1948 U.S. team was led by veteran Gretchen Fraser, who had qualified for the 1940 Olympics, but those Olympics had been canceled because of World War II in Europe. A 15-year-old Vermont native named Andrea Mead was actually getting the most attention of all the American skiers because she had taken first in the slalom and second in the downhill competition during the Olympic tryouts. And again, she's a teenager. The best of the women's ski teams of the Olympics, at least on paper, were the Swiss and the French. The American team was considered too young and too inexperienced to get any significant results. However, if the team could not athletically perform as well as their competitors, said the press, at least the team looked good. And this is a quote from George Trevor of the North American Newspaper Alliance, and he says, quote, though American girl skiers are easier on the ice than most of the foreign competitors, the blunt truth is that our feminine slalom and downhill entrants haven't much of a chance at St. Moritz against the daredevil Wyerly twins of Canada and the accomplished Mademoiselle Georgette Thiolière of France, end quote. And sure enough, the best American performance in the downhill competition was Brynhild Grasmo, who finished 12th. And so it really seemed like the American team was going to live up to this low bar. In the combined slalom event, which averaged a skier's score from a slalom run with their score on a downhill run, Gretchen Fraser quite unexpectedly managed to win silver. Everyone was very shocked by this. So then the next day, after she wins the silver, on February 5th, 1948, it's the last alpine skiing event for the women, and this is the slalom-only competition. If you don't watch a lot of Olympics, don't do a lot of skiing, basically what that means is each skier gets 2 slalom runs, and then the average 2 scores, usually it takes a little less than a minute per run, and so they'll combine those 2 scores, and that's how they decide how people win. So Gretchen actually drew the #1 bib during the run, which meant she had to be the first down the mountain both times. And so she managed to get a combined run of 1 minute 57.2 seconds. And then she had to watch as competitor after competitor tried to beat her time. The Swiss Antoinette Mayer finished her second run 0.5 seconds ahead of Gretchen's second run, but Gretchen's first run had been a full second faster than Meyer's, and no other skiers skied faster than either of Gretchen's times. And so suddenly, Gretchen Fraser, just 6 days away from turning 29 years old, a, quote, good and experienced racer but never a world beater, end quote, had won the gold medal. Wow. She was the first American skier, man or woman, to win a gold medal in any skiing event. On the slopes, after her hard-won victory, Gretchen told a reporter, quote, I trained at Sun Valley, end quote. And those words, and words of her fame, were printed around the country. And after Fraser's endorsement, Sun Valley was, quote, on ski maps forevermore, unquote. Arguably, however, Sun Valley had been on ski maps for well over a decade before Gretchen's win because, since its grand opening in 1936, as we know, it has served as a winter playground for the rich and famous. In fact, celebrity women had been skiing, skating, and playing there since the opening day, and fan magazines and local newspapers alike had always been reporting on their activities. activities. And these famous women didn't come just to be seen and photographed. They skied with the professionals. They participated in a newly popular form of physical recreation at a time when most women's lifestyle and movie fan magazines still advise that women avoid strenuous exercise at nearly all costs. So I argue that as fan magazines reported on these women's activities and behavior at Sun Valley, they actually helped introduce American women to unique ways of using their bodies in public that was uncommon in mainstream America. And so what I mean by this is, prior to this point, women's public bodies often indicated that they were using their sexuality inappropriately, such as in sex work or extramarital sex or premarital sex. And so to advocates of traditional gender roles, women physically using their bodies in public seemed to threaten the current social order because women were not where they should be, and thus the family, which by this time really starts to become the fundamental unit of American society, would deteriorate. And so the stories of Hollywood women at Sun Valley demonstrated that American women could actually use their bodies in public because it was fun and because they enjoyed it, not because they had any grand plot to destroy American society. And I'm not really trying to argue that, like, being in public and using their bodies for their own enjoyment is better than being a wife or a mother or vice versa. But I'm really just instead trying to show that how in the middle of the 20th century, women's expected roles of what they could do in public were still incredibly limited, both because of and in spite of Hollywood's influence, which we will see as we continue. So for generations, American women's main social role was, of course, as a wife and mother, and her influence was limited to teaching her children quote-unquote proper American values like loyalty and patriotism, all within the confines of the private home. By the 1930s, though, it was more common for women to be out in the public sphere, and they were usually working. There's kind of this, I think, widespread assumption that women starting, from the earliest days of the country, they were totally fine with, like, being in the home, and they were, there weren't really big numbers of women in the workforce, really up until World War II. That is not quite true. Women had really always been in the public sphere, and especially starting in, like, the 1890s, they are more and more pushing the boundaries of, like, where they think they should be, and it is increasingly pushing outward. Even though, women's public, physical recreation like sports and working out is really limited. It's not uncommon for women to exercise, but there are limitations to the kind of exercise that they do. But celebrity women, as I say, begin to challenge these social expectations by doing and excelling at sports in public. And again, I'm not trying to argue that women's activities at Sun Valley became the sole or even the most important way that American women challenged the traditional gendered social order. In fact, women's activity at Sun Valley didn't even prove particularly revolutionary, because much of the coverage it received in fan magazines actually encouraged women to return to the private sphere in between their public forays to the ski slopes. Women's activity at the resort, however, did prove to be progressive, advocating for women's place in public physical recreation nearly 30 years before women's sports really ever got any significant attention. So as I said, prior to 1930, women were allowed to exercise, but this exercise was mostly made up of what they called calisthenics. We kind of use that word still, but it usually means things like stretching, light dumbbell work, things we might call yoga, but the women were never allowed to overly exert themselves, sweating or, gaining too much muscle mass. That's too masculine, and you'll lose your femininity. And so a lot of women exercise leaders said that exercise was important, but it was important so that they could be strong and healthy for their work in the private home. Cleaning, caring for children, and anyone who is a stay-at-home mom knows that that's not an easy job. You're running around, you're cleaning things, you're, having sometimes to put your back really into your cleaning tasks. Young kids are insane. It's not an easy task. And so it's like, absolutely, they should be healthy for that. But what people are saying is that's the only reason they should exercise and should be healthy. In the late 1890s, early 1900s, girls' colleges and schools begin incorporating gym classes into their regular curriculum. That often included sports like basketball. Basketball was actually one of the most popular sports for college-age and high school-age girls. But these rules often for the sports had been modified to remove running and remove competition, because competition was also too manly of a characteristic. It brought out too much aggression, too many manly, quote-unquote, characteristics. So even though the young women themselves really wanted to compete and tried to find ways that they could compete without it being too overtly competitive, most sports and exercise leaders said very plainly women's sport should not be competitive. But by the time our story opened, some very talented women had begun to make a space for themselves in the public sporting realm. Suzanne Lenglen, who was French, and Helen Wills, who was American, had made names for themselves in the tennis scene. Babe Didrikson-Zacharias was one of the most prolific American sportswomen. She competitively played golf, basketball, track and field. She won Olympic medals and amateur AAU championships. But in order to avoid accusations of being too masculine, all three of these women had to dress in very feminine ways, both on and off the court/field, and fashion becomes a way that they indicate that they're not trying to break down gender expectations, they're just trying to play sports and have fun. And this idea is going to be important for later, so keep fashion locked away in the back of your mind for a little bit. So skiing was not considered an appropriate feminine activity because unless there was a rope tow of some kind, in order to ski down the mountain, you had to climb it first, and that, of course, is incredibly physically demanding. Sometimes I have to climb a little bit of a hill in mountain biking, and every time I do it, I want to die. So some elite women in Europe did ski sometimes, but it was because their family could afford to go on skiing vacations in the Alps and these other really fancy ski resorts, but they too had to wear the proper clothing to demonstrate that they are not becoming too masculine. Skiing also was not a hugely popular activity in the United States. There were a few ski areas prior to 1930. They were mostly in the east, places like Vermont, Massachusetts, and other New England states, but they were usually really only for serious skiers, not the average vacationer. And then comes the 1932 Winter Olympic Games held in Lake Placid, New York. This is the first Winter Olympics hosted in the United States, and thus the first time that many Americans had heard of this sort of quote-unquote new sport called skiing. And though most of the medal winners at Lake Placid were almost exclusively Scandinavian because skiing originated in Norway, Americans were fascinated. And then a man named W. Averill Harriman had an idea. Harriman was chairman of the Union Pacific Railroad, which had lost a lot of passenger travel during the Great Depression. And realizing how popular skiing had become, especially among American elites, he recognized that the only real ski resorts, these really fancy places where you could come and stay and it was luxurious and you didn't have to work that hard, you could go ski outside and come back in and be near, you know, this really beautiful fireplace and you're getting to chat with, it's like a social scene. There's nothing like that in the United States. They really only had those skiing areas that I mentioned a few moments ago. So Harriman hired an Austrian count named Felix Schaffgotsch. Schaffgotsch had developed skiing resorts in Austria, that's why Harriman had hired him. And Harriman hired the count to find the ideal area for a ski resort in the American West. And the count required 4 conditions for an ideal ski resort. There needed to be dry powdered snow, there needed to be sunshine, they wanted the slopes to be open and sort of freeing, you didn't want to feel confined, and they also wanted really beautiful wooded hills for beautiful scenery. And he went everywhere in the American West to find a location that had all these places. He went to Mount Hood near Seattle, he went to Portland, he went to Yosemite and Tahoe in California, he went to Zion National Park and Salt Lake City in Utah, he went to Denver, Brighton, and Alta in Colorado. He actually almost found exactly what he was looking for in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, but the state refused to let the Teton Pass stay open for the winter, negating the whole point of the resort. During his first original tour, he had visited Idaho, but he had only visited the Boise area, and he didn't love what he found there, at least for a ski resort. As we know, of course, Bogus Basin is there, so it was possible, but it wasn't perfect for what the Count and Harriman were trying to do. So the story goes that the man who had shown the Count around Idaho the first time, was telling this friend in Boise about the Count's visit, that he had taken him around the area and he was looking for this really nice ski resort, but he didn't really find it there. And his friend asked if he had taken the Count to the Ketchum area. And the man hadn't, so he immediately wired the Count, asked him to come back, took him out to Ketchum, and after the Count had spent only a few hours on the slopes in Ketchum, he immediately sent a telegram to W. Averill Harriman, and it said, quote, "Among the many attractive spots I have visited, this combines more delightful features than any other place I have seen in the United States, Switzerland, or Austria for a winter sports resort." End quote.
Wow. What year is that?
35.
35. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ketchum is perfect. The valley floor is over a mile high. It has a semi-arid climate that makes dry powder snow, that white, that light fluffy stuff that makes like really good snowballs. There's warm sun even in freezing temperatures, and the surrounding sawtooths protect the area from cold northern winds, and so it's actually quite pleasant to be outside. Plus, the Union Pacific's most expensive railroad spur already ended there. And so, Harriman decides this is the place. On March 25th, 1936, the Union Pacific announced that they had purchased 3,388 acres of ranch land from a local man named Ernest Brass for $10.04 an acre, about $39,000 total. After they bought this, Harriman hired a press agent named Steve Hannigan. Hannigan was famous because he had made a small stretch of sand in Florida into something you might have heard of called Miami Beach. There are two people with very similar names. So we have Averell Harriman, who is, the man who is in charge. Then you have Steve Hannigan, who is the press agent. So those names come into play quite a bit with each other. So Hannigan recommended that Harriman shouldn't build this quaint little lodge like Harriman had sort of originally envisioned, but instead he should build a huge glamorous hotel to draw in the country's elite. But before they could even start building, they needed a new name for this place. The naming of Sun Valley has a lot of lore around it, and I couldn't exactly find out what the true story was. Some developers suggested keeping the name Ketchum for the resort, but Hannigan rejected that. And this is a line from his biography. It says, quote, "There might have been a few names less sexy, but he couldn't think of any," end quote. Which is so great.
Shots fired.
It's not a pretty name. I love Ketchum. Yeah. It's not a pretty name. I get it.
Yeah, it's very ketchup-y. Like, it does not roll off the tongue the way Sun Valley does.
It kind of sounds like a those old like redneck sayings where catch 'em,
He got away, but he catched 'em.
Yeah. Exactly. The most prominent story about how Sun Valley becomes Sun Valley is that Hannigan had thought of it when he was visiting Ketchum for the first time, and he had to take off his outer coat because even though it was winter, the sun was so warm, it was so close, and I can confirm the sun is very warm out there even when it is cold. Credit for the name is also given to Averell Harriman and to Count Shaftgotch, but Harriman himself stated, he said, quote, "We just started calling it Sun Valley. Nobody named it," end quote. And regardless of how the name came about, as we know, it stuck. As Harriman begins developing the resort, Hannigan recommended it, making a place where, quote, "roughing it must be a luxury. If it is to be done right in the beginning, it will draw national attention, acclaim, and approval. If it is half done at the start, you will be years selling the progress you plan," end quote. So in other words, Hannigan tells Harriman, you do it right or you don't do it at all. And so that's what they set out to do. The resort had really great sporting amenities. Besides the ski slopes, of course, they had a heated outdoor pool, a full-size skating rink, and equipment for dog sledding and ski joring. Do you guys know what ski joring is?
No.
It is where you ski behind a horse.
Oh, yeah.
Like you get, it's like being pulled for like water skiing, but the boat is a horse.
Yeah, and they pull them off jumps. I've seen that in Wyoming before. It's really fun to watch.
I would not want to do it, but it looks fun. I actually don't know how to ski also. Doing my research in Sun Valley made me want to be like, I want to learn how to ski. Harriman, of course, wants to set the ski resort apart from eastern ski areas, and he thought the best way to do this was to help guests get to the top of the ski run without having to exert all their energy. As of course, one of the ways to get up to the top of the ski hills was to climb. They did have some rope tows at these early ski areas. You would hold on to it, just hold on to the rope, basically, and they would have a little machine that would just take the skiers up the mountain. But Doris Taylor, who ended up being the Sun Valley publicity director, she said you would hold on to these rope tows and you would just it would almost pull your arms out of place, that you would just break your arms hanging on to them, is I think what she said. So they just were really uncomfortable. So Harriman commissioned some Union Pacific engineers to create a new device to help get people up to the top of the mountain. And so UP engineer Jim Curran developed the idea of the chairlift inspired by machines that transported bananas off boats in the tropics. So after several different prototypes, the first ever monocable single rider chairlift in the world, complete with blanket for ultimate comfort of the rider, was installed at Sun Valley, Idaho. And if you've ever been to a ski resort ever in your life, you know how important the chairlift is at ski resorts. And so if you've ever ridden one, you have Sun Valley to thank, which is amazing.
That's really cool. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. That's wild.
Yeah, so cool. And the inside of the resort was luxurious and glamorous. It had a bachelor's lounge, a club room, a game room with like ping pong tables, a barber shop, a beauty parlor, its own doctor's office, which included an x-ray, and it had a branch of Saks Fifth Avenue, which is high fashion, to ensure that women were always properly attired while at the resort. The exterior of the lodge appears to be constructed with real trees, but there were concerns over the weathering of the wood by the extreme weather conditions, as well as, of course, the fire hazard that it posed. So instead, they poured cement into forms of pine trees, and now we have a lodge that looks like it is built with real wood, but it's concrete. By its completion, the cost of the hotel and resort was $1.5 million in 1936. Any guesses as to what that translates to in 2024?
I'm going to guess 13 million.
I'm going to guess like 50 million.
Ooh, kind of, Sam was closer, but kind of in the middle. It was 34 million.
Dang.
Which I think really for like building a resort, like if you were to like modern day build a resort, I feel like 34 million would be like cheap.
Wow.
So now, Harriman has a resort, he has a lodge, but now what he needs is people. Hannigan had a specific strategy for this. He said, quote, "The key is not merely to get people there, but to get the right people there for the opening. Society is like a band of sheep. Get a few bellwethers headed in the right direction, and the rest will surely clamor after," end quote. And he's not wrong, to be honest. And so, in the months prior to its opening, Hannigan had convinced a Hollywood producer named David O. Selznick to make a movie in Ketchum in the winter of 1936. And by doing so, this ensured that the film stars, Claudette Colbert, Robert Young, and Melvyn Douglas, were automatic attendees for the grand opening. So you get some of the biggest Hollywood stars in Ketchum for this grand opening. They're going to talk their friends into coming, because who wants to be at this opening of a resort in the middle of nowhere without all their friends? So then, Hannigan commissions press releases and advertisements about Sun Valley to appear in what he called quote-unquote higher types of magazines. And by this he means magazines aimed specifically at the country's richest and most famous. So with these ads, he brings in a heck of a list of opening night attendees. They include Gloria Baker, who is the heiress to the Bromo Seltzer fortune. Bromo Seltzer, I had to look this up, is a brand of antacid to relieve pain from indigestion. It's kind of the original Alka-Seltzer. It's a little bit different for reasons that I don't understand, because I'm a historian. So Gloria Baker was there. Mr. and Mrs. Nelson Rockefeller came. Fred Pabst of Pabst Blue Ribbon. The DuPonts of the chemical and car company. The Studebakers of car manufacturer fame, and other Hollywood luminaries, which also included actresses Madeline Carroll and Joan Bennett. So it's a who's who. On opening day, everything was perfect, except for one thing. They didn't have any snow. So Harriman, understanding the importance of good press, ordered that all the guests would be allowed to stay at the resort for free until it snowed. But they kept the opening party, and the party was glitzy and it was glamorous. They had fancy imported food. They had like a French chef make all these fancy dishes that I'd never heard of, lots of champagne, and one of the biggest bands in the country, as selected by band leader and jazz musician Eddie Dukin. Dance floor at the lodge might still be named, or at least it was named, the Eddie Dukin Lounge, or something like that when it first opened. So it was like a big tribute to him. So Sun Valley lore has it that a prominent Chicago banker named Charles F. Glore approached a table where the Hollywood producer David O. Selznick sat with actresses Joan Bennett and Claudette Colbert and the women's husbands. And Glore apparently asked one of the women to dance, a request that Selznick found so offensive that he punched Glore right in the face. And Harriman and the other staff were horrified, and they just dreaded. They called Hannigan and were so nervous to tell him the opening night was ruined. And Hannigan replies, "What are you talking about? The opening ruined? This is wonderful. It will make headlines in every paper in the country." And allegedly, he sat down and wrote the title out himself, and the title was Sun Valley Opens with a Bang. Finally, snow fell on Christmas Day, and the New Year's party, attended by even more celebrities and socialites, was deemed a quote-unquote cheery affair. So what is clear is from the very beginning, Harriman and Hannigan saw Sun Valley as a place where money and luxury reigned supreme. As Harriman said, quote, "We didn't run the resort to make money. We ran it to be a perfect place," end quote. From this point forward, after I tell the story of Sun Valley, how it becomes what it is, I really start to insert my argument, which for the chapter is this. And as I kind of mentioned, as women from Hollywood skied slopes in the Sawtooth Mountains and fan magazines reported their exploits, celebrity women's physical recreation at Sun Valley played a role in developing a new image of the American woman, one who could use her body to ski down mountainsides clothed in the highest fashion for the purposes of her own benefit and enjoyment. Because let me tell you, fan magazines talked about Sun Valley all the time, and I think it's fair to say that at the very least, the resort was well known all over the country. In the April 1941 issue of a popular fan magazine called Photoplay, readers could take a quiz called How Well Do You Know Your Hollywood? Question number 6 reads, quote, she was awarded the honor of being the best amateur skier at Sun Valley, end quote. And there are 4 options for this answer. Norma Shearer, Claudette Colbert, Joan Crawford, or Irene Dunn. Anthony or Sam, do you guys have any guesses?
I'm going to go with Irene Dunn.
Okay.
That's what I was going to do, but...
Oh, I love it. Well, the answer is actually Claudette Colbert, who, by 1936, she was a massive star. 2 years before, in 1934, she had starred and gotten critical acclaim for 3 movies in just 1 year. She was in It Happened One Night, the original Cleopatra, and the original version of a really great movie called Imitation of Life. And she actually won the Oscar in 1934 as well. So by 1936, she is one of the most well-known women of Hollywood. And she was awarded the honor of being the best amateur skier at Sun Valley. As we know, Colbert first comes to Sun Valley when she's making the movie in Ketchum for opening night. It turns into a movie. It's called I Met Him in Paris, and she learned how to ski while on set. This was the only, and I can talk about this a little bit later as well, the first movie to be filmed in Sun Valley. It's one of the only ones that were filmed there where the principal actors were actually on location. Like, most of the time, film crews would come in and, like, film the scenery, and then they would, like, film everything else back in a studio. But that was not the case for I Met Him in Paris. So Claudette Colbert, she skis on screen, she skates on screen, and in fact, she learned a little bit of skiing, but Gretchen Fraser actually doubles for Claudette Colbert in I Met Him in Paris, because of course she was training there. But Colbert really gets this, like, skiing bug. She's bit by it, she really likes it, and so she starts to come back regularly, so regularly that she starts to begin to be able to compete in skiing. Now remember, competing is, like, it's a little sketchy, you know, it's just a borderline too masculine. I found one photo in the Sun Valley Ski Club annual newsletter. It was a newsletter that got sent out to just people who belonged to the Sun Valley Ski Club. And this picture shows Colbert at the top of a ski run next to Sun Valley ski trainer Friedel Pfeiffer. And she's got this paper bib with the number 49 across her dark winter sweater. And I'm not completely sure, but this might be a photo from 1941 when she competed in a guest slalom race at Sun Valley, and she won first in this race that she participated in. And she didn't only finish first, she finished a full 51 seconds ahead of second place. And that year, in fact, she was so good, she was listed as an alternate member for the California team at the annual interstate ski meet. And the better she became, the more ambitious she got. Friedel Pfeiffer remembered that when Colbert found out about a race at Sun Valley called the Standard Race that had 3 difficulty levels, she wanted more than the bare minimum. So the 3 levels were silver, gold, and diamond. And Pfeiffer says, quote, I told her she should just try for the silver, but she said, no, I want the gold. So I trained her for it. It took about at least a week. I run with her 3 or 4 times a day, end quote. The results of that race are not clear, but what is clear is that Colbert is a competent amateur skier. And in fact, she's so good that her activities at Sun Valley are regularly mentioned as like a big part of her life in national fan magazines. The earliest articles that mentioned her skiing was from May 1938, and it mentions that when she was not busy on the set of I Met Him in Paris, quote, you can find her skiing on one of the nursery slopes, end quote. So that's like the bunny hill. A few months later, in September 1938, she reported about her attempts of skiing at Sun Valley, quote, skiing looked very simple until I tried it. I never did get off what they called the nursery slope, end quote.
Me neither.
Yeah, right. I've been snowboarding once in my life, and the friend who took me was very good, and I just was on the bunny slope to the point where she was just like, can I just leave you? And I was like, yeah, I'll just meet you at the lodge, it's fine. So anyway, Colbert catches the skiing bug, and this bug transforms her into a strong, healthy woman in a way that she hadn't anticipated. And this is a quote from this fan magazine article. It's from 1938 in the Motion Picture magazine, and it says, quote, I made a self-discovery. I'm afraid I am the athletic type. I'd always thought of myself as a rather delicate flower. I did rather fancy myself on the lace and tissue paper side. I did feel I might flop if I did anything very strenuous. And then she says, I've got all over that prettily fragile notion of myself. I can stand anything. I am now enjoying very good health. I've always had the notion that a person's type pretty much tells the story of what they are. Well, I've been deceiving myself about myself all these years, end quote. quote. So in some ways, she kind of appears hesitant to admit she's athletic. She says, I'm afraid I'm the athletic type. But this quote, I think, could really begin to serve as a way for female readers to ask if they might also be deceiving themselves about their athletic abilities. And so this quote and Claudette Colbert's experience really demonstrates, I think, to women readers the kind of self-confidence, strength, and health that might be gained from skiing, or at the very least, exercise. Another article profiled the many awards that Colbert had won for her competitive ski racing. From Photoplay in 1940, it says, quote, pinned over the mirror is one of the most important items in her house, a little silver sun hanging from a pair of skis. Claudette won this last winter in Sun Valley, and it's the pride of her life, end quote. So again, Sun Valley is being mentioned by name in national fan magazines, reaching millions of Americans all over the country. This same article, though, this Photoplay article, is very quick to clarify that her competitiveness is not incompatible with her image as a feminine movie star, though she says she originally refused to race because her role as a traditional wife may have been at risk. But then the article goes on and it says, quote, now it's different. Claudette is no longer burdened by the fact that she's the man of her family. She definitely isn't the man of her family, end quote. And so though Claudette Colbert is an international movie star with the ability to push back against traditional gender norms, she also had to maintain a sense of femininity so that she was not accused of being too masculine. And so these are the kind of contradictory messages that readers are coming up against in fan magazines, right? Is you see this incredible image of Claudette Colbert being like, guess what? I'm skiing and now I'm healthy. I'm like tough. I can handle anything. But then the fan magazines, the writers of these articles are saying, but she's still a wife above all. She still goes home and takes care of what she needs to take care of, even if she's out doing these incredible things on the ski slopes. So Claudette Colbert was one of the best celebrity skiers, but by no means was she the only celebrity skier. Norma Shearer, who was the first 5-time Oscar nominee and just the 3rd Best Actress Oscar winner, was a huge figure in Sun Valley history. And I, love Norma Shearer, with all of my heart, even before I went to Sun Valley. And when I found out that she was in Sun Valley a lot, I was like, well, this is the best news I've ever heard. Norma came to Sun Valley about every winter after her first visit in 1938. She'd been married to a major film producer named Irving Thalberg, who had tragically died from complications of pneumonia from a congenital heart condition in 1936. So a couple years later, she's finally ready to start really being in public again, and so she heads to Sun Valley and has a blast. In the 1940s, the Sun Valley Ski Club did this thing where skiers who descended Dollar Mountain, which is about 2,100 feet, they'd get a 1-star pin. And then if they descended Bald Mountain, or Baldy, as we all tend to call it now and called it even back then, Baldy is about 3,200 feet, and you got 2 stars, 2-star pin for going down Baldy. In January 1942, Shearer and her teenage son Irving Thalberg Jr. each earned a 1-star pin, and Norma went on to earn a 2-star pin a few years later. A popular 1950s musical actress, Jane Powell, who, if you've seen Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, she's the main actress in that. She earned a 1-star pin in the spring ski season of 1948. Norma Shearer's good friends and actresses Anne Rutherford and Ann Southern each also earned 1-star pins within the same 2-week span in February 1949. Anne Rutherford, if anyone is a big movie fan, her most famous role is as the youngest O'Hara sister in Gone with the Wind. All this to say, it's very clear. Celebrity women are, again, not just at Sun Valley to be seen, but they're actually skiing and having a good time. By all accounts, the celebrity women just really liked skiing. Ann Southern gave an oral history to the people at the library, and she says, quote, I couldn't wait to get out there. As a matter of fact, I'd be on the mountain all the times if I was there. I'd just be there from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4. Everybody skied. You'd see all your friends on the hill, and I'd get on the lift, and the operators always called me Annie. Hiya, Annie. Good morning, Annie. Give me a slap on the little fanny, and away we'd go. Quote. She's so funny. I love Ann Southern. Even though many fan magazine articles claimed that celebrities were no different than average Americans while at Sun Valley, and this was kind of a claim that I worked on a little bit in my paper, in my dissertation, and I'm still working on it, but there's kind of this idea that anyone could come to Sun Valley and learn how to ski. You know, if you're a middle-aged mother, you can learn. If you're an 18-year-old kid, you can learn. Anyone can do it. And you're all equal while you're at Sun Valley. There's not a difference. But what we find is that it's very clear that actresses at the resort, they're playing by a different set of rules than everyone else. But they were also putting themselves kind of in more danger than the average person as well. Peppy Teichner, who was one of the ski instructors and top skiing professionals at Sun Valley, wrote an article for the Haley Times newspaper, which was the local newspaper, and in it he commented on the courage it took for movie stars to fly down the slopes at breakneck speed. And he says, quote, "If we ski instructors crack up, it doesn't matter so much. But for those movie people, it is different. If they race, they risk not only a little more salary than we get, but also a whole career. I have all the respect for the courage Norma Shearer showed while skiing for her silver ski prize. And I said to myself, if I should become a movie star, I would not race anymore," end quote. Movie star and dancer Ginger Rogers visited Sun Valley just once in 1938, and she actually wanted to sneak off to Dollar Mountain to try to figure out skiing by herself. But as she's trying to do this, she realizes that there were these two men that were following her, and so she turns to them and she says, "I want to tackle this by myself. I've never been on skis before. I don't want any publicity." And they replied that it wasn't her publicity that they were concerned about, but the hotel's. They told her, "If you fall and break a leg, that would be bad publicity for the hotel. We are here to see that you stay on your feet."
Smart. Yeah.
Yeah, Ann Southern began skiing in Sun Valley in 1948, but she always skied with an instructor to prevent any major accidents. She says, "I was under contract, you see, to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and if I'd broken something, I really would have been in trouble." So what we're seeing, of course, is like these women are putting their bodies at risk. Teichner said, if they crash, that could all but end their careers. And so it becomes clear that female celebrities are skiing because they want to, because they like what it does for them and for the feeling that they get from it. And so they are pushing back against traditional gender roles by using their bodies in risky public physical exercise, not because the studios needed or wanted them to, and not because skiing would keep them physically fit for their private careers as wives and mothers. They did it because they liked it, because they wanted to. Because skiing had been considered a masculine sport for most of its history, women had to find ways to legitimize their presence on the ski slopes. And what I find is the major way that they do that is through fashion. So, according to reports, the lodge opened with a branch of Saks Fifth Avenue because Harriman and Hannigan recognized that ensuring proper fashions were always available to the glamorous people that they had lured to the resort was essential. So by 1940, Saks had been replaced by a store of Swiss fashion designer F.A. Picard, whose designs had become publicly connected with Sun Valley in local and national advertisements. As I said earlier, most Americans were first introduced to this newish sport of skiing with the 1932 Winter Olympics, and Americans were enthralled by it. By 1937, just 5 years after the Lake Placid Olympics, the ski industry made nearly $20 million, which is roughly $37 million in 2024. It was estimated that clothing made up nearly 30% of that sum, almost $6 million. This is double the amount that the industry made in skis and bindings, which is fundamental equipment necessary to participate in the sport. So what that means is more people are interested in buying skiing fashions than are actually skiing. And why is that? Because more and more women are coming to these public ski resorts. Skiing fashion had become so big that an article which appeared in the Idaho Statesman captioned the image of a young woman dressed in a fashionable wool coat and matching wool pants like this. It says, quote, "Who cares whether or not she can ski? It would be much better to have her stand still so we can see every detail of this black and white suit." At any rate, there is simply no excuse now for Boiseans not to be perfectly outfitted for the sport, whether they indulge in it on the Sawtooth slopes or in the milder undulations of Boise's foothills, end quote. So because of Saks and then Picard's, fashion is clearly a top priority at Sun Valley. Promotional movies like Sun Valley Skiing and Sun Valley Holiday, which archivist Kelly Moulton at the community library thinks were shown at UP railroad stations, these promotional movies promised, like I said, that anyone can learn how to ski. And so publicity about the resorts in these movies advertised that a truly fashionable woman would not miss a chance to visit the ski shop. One of the narration bits says, quote, "Smart girls jockey a bit to cheat the sun and win and retain a snappy appearance." As skiing became fashionable and fashion turned to skiing, Sun Valley itself becomes fashionable as a place where anyone who is anyone was photographed. And so as I said, though most celebrity women visited Sun Valley to ski, there were some who came just to have their picture taken, which I think shows how well known the resort had become. Skiing wasn't necessary to having a good time there and to getting, I think, the benefits of the association with the resort. One of my favorite quotes comes from an actress named Rosalind Russell about her good friend and actress Loretta Young, and I think about this quote every day. And she says, "The most athletic thing Loretta will do in Sun Valley is sew a sequin on an evening dress." Which is amazing. And Loretta Young, she came, but again, it was her husband who did the skiing. So there were some women who came just to be seen, but they seem to really understand how important and what sort of implications that an association with this little tiny ski resort in Idaho had. It's so interesting.
If you ever see me at a ski resort, that's why I'm there too.
Showing off your fashion.
Yeah, I'll be showing off I'll probably be playing piano.
Anthony is like, I have so many sequins to sew on these dresses.
Exactly. Bedazzling. Yeah.
Bedazzling your piano. I would love to see it.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. Ski fashion is regularly advertised, not just in fashion magazines, but in movie fan magazines as a way to help American women dress fashionably, even if they couldn't afford to go skiing. And fashion and clothing were not the only consumer products that fan magazines are advertising that ties together skiing and the luxury of Sun Valley. Articles and advertisements endorse soaps, creams, and lotions that prevented, quote, the hurt of chapped, roughened, cracked skin, end quote, from winter cold and wind. And accessories were just as important too, with one advertisement claiming, quote, smoked or colored glasses are a boon to the eyes on snow jaunts, and you won't catch any of the stars off on snow jaunts to Sun Valley or other places without them, end quote. So again, the fact that Sun Valley is mentioned by name suggests that even the average American knew the resort and its reputation thanks to the celebrity influence there. And celebrities were well aware of the role that fashion played in their activities at Sun Valley. Norma Shearer was constantly mentioned as one of the most fashionable women to ever visit Sun Valley. Her beautiful clothing always made an impression on Ketchum residents. This is a really great story. There's a story that goes, in order to stay warm on the way up the mountain, Norma had this beautiful white woolen coat from Picards on. She wore it while she was on the ski lift. As she's going up the mountain, she says she doesn't want to wear it down the slope. It's like too fashionable to be worn that way. I think she'd get too hot. So she asks the operator, can I wear it up the mountain and then can I just send it down on an empty chair? And they were like, yeah, that's fine. And her style is apparently so well known to visitors. There's a quote that says, quote, ecstatic teenagers watched the coat and cried, here comes Norma, every time it came into view, end quote. And so even though it's just this coat on this empty chair coming down, everyone knows, oh, Norma Shearer went up in that coat. And so they're seeing this coat come down being like, oh my gosh, it's Norma Shearer. But it's not. And so there's also this really close connection between these huge Hollywood people and like Ketchum natives, this coming together that we would not see, of course, without Sun Valley. And then one of my favorite things about celebrity women's presence in Sun Valley is just how many of them became permanent fixtures in the area. As I said, Norma Shearer first came in 1938, and then she starts to come a lot more after that, especially after she meets her children's ski instructor, whose name was Marty Arrouget. Arrouget was a college skier at the University of Nevada at Reno, and he actually took a job being a ski instructor at Sun Valley starting in 1939. And Clara Spiegel, who is a Chicago socialite and Sun Valley regular, remembered, quote, practically every time I came in or out of my room, Marty was on his way to Norma's room at the end of the hall, and I never saw him come back, end quote. But this was more than just a fleeting romance. The two of them married in 1942 and remained married until Shearer's death in 1983. And they came back to Sun Valley almost every year, and they were very close friends with all of the locals. Ketchum native Anita Gray told this story of Norma, quote, we threw parties occasionally for the same people we were trying to entertain in the winter. The first time Norma Shearer came, she brought vodka in a bottle. I said, Norma, for Pete's sakes, I have vodka. And she said, oh, I was afraid you didn't, end quote. And so, like, they're just mingling, and I love that she's, like, bringing vodka, and Anita Gray's like, no, but I have vodka. And she was just like, oh, well, I wanted to make sure you did because I love vodka. Like, just these funny, humanizing stories is really one of the things I loved most about doing this research. And in fact, when Anita Gray and two other Ketchum women opened the community's first thrift store called the Gold Mine, which is still there.
Oh, I love the Gold Mine.
Yeah, so Norma Shearer was the first person to donate anything to the Gold Mine, and she donated items almost every single year. And so the Gold Mine, kind of continued and got a little bit, I think was sustained in part because these really famous women are contributing to it. Anne Southern, another popular actress. In the 1940s, she had starred in a series of movies in which she played a character named Maisie. She could sing really beautifully. She was sometimes in musicals, but mostly she was in, like, romantic dramas. And she's just this cute, really lovely, wonderful girl. And as you heard, she loved to ski. She says, everyone skis. I loved it. But she loved Sun Valley for more than just skiing. She came back regularly during the height of her career. In the 1950s, she actually opened up a sewing shop in Ketchum called Anne Southern Sewing Center. There she offered sewing classes, sold fabrics, and after a few years, quote, got into selling almost anything you wanted around, end quote. Sewing Center was open for about 6 years, but then her business manager got sick and she had to close it. And she said, quote, I was very sorry to do that, end quote. When she retired, she She built a house in Ketchum and lived in Ketchum for the rest of her life. She died in 2001 at her Ketchum home and is actually buried in the Ketchum cemetery. And her daughter Tish still lives in the area. My project actually stops around 1950, so I don't want to cover too much about the celebrities who came after that. Actress Janet Leigh, who's the famous actress in Psycho and mom to Jamie Lee Curtis, she loved it in Sun Valley. Louis Armstrong came. Marilyn Monroe came to film a movie in 1956. Of course, we know Ernest Hemingway. His buddies included Clark Gable, Gary Cooper and his family. Ingrid Bergman came a couple times because she was good friends with Hemingway. You know, they came out to Sun Valley, and as you might know, Hemingway, he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls in one of the hotel rooms of the lodge. And of course, he ended up dying in Ketchum. And you'll see if you visit, if you haven't, you'll see Hemingway everywhere out there. My parents actually remember being parking attendants at Bruce Willis and Demi Moore's wedding in Sun Valley in the 90s, I think. Word is that Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson had, or still have, maybe, a house in Sun Valley. So Sun Valley has had a constant celebrity presence since its very opening night in December 1936. And I feel so thrilled and honored to have had the opportunity to learn about this hugely important piece of Idaho history, but also to show its larger importance, right? That this is a place where celebrity women can come and do something that they've never done before. And celebrity is such a new concept at the time that they had immense power, I think, to influence the average American movie fan. But Hollywood and the people who produce the fan magazines, they also recognize that. And so they start to really push back against this idea that, like, oh, women should be out in public doing whatever they want. What we see by the 1940s is actually that they, even as women are entering the workforce, as we know with Rosie the Riveter and things like that, Hollywood and fan magazines, publicity is constantly trying to tell women, sure, you can do these public things, it's fine, but you need to go back to the home. And then once the war is over, we see an even more increasing expectation, this tight expectation that women go back home and they remain in the home. One of the other sections to my dissertation is at the end of every chapter that talks about this place. I then have sort of movie readings about movies that are connected to the site I examine in the chapter. So, believe it or not, in Sun Valley's case, there were 3 films that were set in Sun Valley between 1941 and 1950. This is the only time I've ever found in Hollywood's golden age that there are any movies set in Sun Valley. But they're not only set in Sun Valley, like the titles allude to them. So the first one is called Sun Valley Serenade. It's from 1941. Other main one that I look at is called The Duchess of Idaho. It's from 1950. And there was a third one. It's called That Wonderful Urge. It was a remake of another earlier movie. It was set in Sun Valley very briefly, and so I'm happy to talk about it, but in this case, I'll just kind of leave it out. These other 2, Sun Valley Serenade and Duchess of Idaho, take place in Sun Valley, are sort of about these female characters who, for some reason, end up in Sun Valley trying to woo men. And what I end up arguing and show in my film readings of these is how we start to see that women's sporting activities are starting to be shown on screen, and Hollywood is like, yeah, that's okay. The reason that they start to say, okay, yes, it's fine, is because the actresses in both of these movies were actually professional sportswomen before they were actresses. So in the case of Sun Valley Serenade, the main actress, her name was Sonja Henie. She was from Norway. She was I think, 4-time Olympic gold medalist and 10-time world champion figure skater. And she's actually credited, she's the one who started wearing like really feminine skirts and shorter skirts and started to like choreograph her skating to music. She's kind of considered like on the forefront of modern day figure skating. So she's in Sun Valley Serenade. And so the second one, The Duchess of Idaho, stars Esther Williams. And Esther Williams was a 3-time national U.S. swimming champion. She had qualified for the I think, again, the 1940 Olympics that were going to be held in Japan, in Tokyo, I think. Obviously, those got canceled because of the war. So she ended up doing these things called aquacades, which are like swimming circuses, kind of. Like, it's like a swimming show you'd go see, and it would like tour like a circus, kind of. And then she ended up getting attention and getting a movie contract. Anyway, that's a huge tangent. But both of these actresses, because they're sportswomen first, and because they have these really like slim, athletic bodies, and you're watching them like perform these gorgeous swimming and figure skating skating, musical numbers within these movies. The film, Hollywood and the filmmakers and these people who are trying to promote the idea that women need to return to the home, you cannot have Sonia Heaney and Esther Williams on screen and say like, oh, you can't play sports or you can't exercise. And so what they have to do is they say, okay, fine. You can go figure skating, you can go skiing, you can go swimming, fine. But your entire goal has to be to get married. And you have to take those athletic endeavors and contain them within marriage. Because if you suddenly go out and you become this professional sportswoman and you never settle down, then how are we ever going to have families? And then the United States is going to crumble. Of course, it's all very like doom and gloom. And this is, a huge oversimplification, of course. But this is kind of the attitude. And so that is my rant, my nice, hour-long rant about Hollywood and early Hollywood and Sun Valley.
Well, thank you, Skye. That's very, very interesting.
Yeah, that was really cool, very thorough. I've always wondered how it came about that Sun Valley became such a beacon, but that makes total sense. I mean, it's a very expensive hobby to have. It's not just kind of open to anybody, but I can see why it's become like the premier space to go skiing. The Bunny Hill on Bogus Basin is as close to being a skier as I've ever made it. And even then it was, I just didn't have a lot. I couldn't, learn to ski or get my own skis or snowboards growing up.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this is kind of, like I said, I kind of wrestle with this question of like, they say everyone can learn how to ski, and that is probably true. But obviously what that advertising leaves out is everyone can learn to ski, but not everyone can get to Sun Valley to learn how to ski.
Yeah.
It opens in 1936. It's right at the tail end of the Great Depression. And then obviously it's in rural Idaho. Like, unless you live in Ketchum, the likelihood that you are going to be able to have 2 weeks off of work to then take the train to Ketchum, because the train was the only way to get to Ketchum at the time. And so you could take a train directly from LA to Ketchum. It took like 5 days or something crazy. So literally it was like a 2-week minimum that these people would vacation at Sun Valley, because it took so long to get out there and to get back. And then you wanted all your time to like spend on vacation. And so it was usually at least 2 weeks that these people were there. So no average American can just be like, hey, we're just going to leave for 2 weeks. And then you have to have disposable income to buy the equipment, like you're saying. They have to then pay for food and lodging out there. Like, it is not a cheap endeavor. And then, of course, that completely leaves out people of color, especially Black Americans who, barely can afford amusements. But even I read a piece about the Black middle class and how even if the Black middle class could afford it, and often they could, going to places that were predominantly white visitors made Black travel very difficult. And because the railroad was the only way to get into town, that prohibited a lot of Black visitors, because their treatment on trains was often terrible, even by the 30s. And a lot of advertisements about Sun Valley and taking this train into Ketchum actually emphasize the fact that the porters on the train are Black. And so really showing that, like, there is this claim that everyone can learn how to ski. There's sort of this democratic, like, and if the celebrities come, that these residents of Ketchum, they don't bother the celebrities. They never ask them for their autograph. They kind of pretend that they're just, these normal people. And so there's this claim of, like, democracy and everyone's equal. But the lived reality is, of course, a little bit different. So absolutely, speaking to this is, this point that you're making is, there is kind of this, like, tricky claim that really proves to not necessarily be the case. And, like, growing up, my family was solidly middle class. Granted, we weren't outdoorsy, so we didn't go to Sun Valley, but I also don't know how much disposable income my family could have sacrificed to buy 5 people skis and bindings and all the clothes that come with it and the helmet and the, all the stuff that comes with it. It's not a cheap hobby. So yes, anyway, that was just something I wanted to add on, because it is a point that I have really been wrestling with, and that hopefully if I get this turned into a book, which there may be a lead, that's one of the things I'm really going to have to clear up, is this really tricky idea of democracy at Sun Valley.
That would make a really good book, Skye. Forgive me for this comment, but you knew I was going to take it here. Annie Oakley, she was such a talented sharpshooter in a day where women weren't expected to be sharpshooters. And so to kind of balance that, she was expected to dress not just feminine, but like almost overly feminine. To like emphasize like she may be beating the guys, but like at the end of the day, remember she's just a gal.
Yeah, she's a lady, yeah.
There is this expectation that if you're going to do a man's sport, you need to remind everyone that you're not a man.
It's the tricky, gender politics of this time. And this is, I think, one of the things that I really enjoyed the most and that I have to continue to work on is that this is kind of an unusual time where, like, in the 1920s, there was this sort of explosion of like women, especially young women, going out in public despite all of the social and cultural leaders and their parents who were like, oh my gosh, this is very scary. Like you're going out and you're, using your sexuality inappropriately and you're dressing crazy and you're drinking a lot. And so then in the 1930s, there's this kind of awkward, like, women can't, this is a really terrible way to say this, I feel like, but like women can't be put back in that box anymore, despite the attempts, right? So like during the Great Depression, all the social and cultural leaders were like, women don't go to work because there are men who have families who need jobs and you're just taking jobs from these married men who need to make money for their families. But women are still like in the workforce. Like you see, I think, if I'm correct, you actually do see more women working in public in the 30s than you even see in the 20s. And so it is this really tricky cultural moment because you have women who are more famous than anyone in the world with these Hollywood celebrities who are doing things that are very unusual for women to be doing, and yet Hollywood has to use them to show even Hollywood women, these working women that we think are sort of outside of these norms, P.S. they're not, and so like don't think that you can get out of your station because even though they're at this height, they can't get out of it either, right? And so and I have to be careful to make sure that I'm not trying to say that like Hollywood is this like big cabal who's like just been trying to keep women down forever. That isn't the case. I think a lot of reformers were genuine, their thought process, and really felt that they were doing the right thing, and I can't take that away from them. But I also think celebrity women really shake up the situation, I think in a way that hasn't been studied, but that I think needs to be studied. So anyway, there's another soapbox for you. But yeah, that's what I'm trying to do with my project, right? Is answer all these questions and bring up all these things and show that even a little tiny town like Ketchum, Idaho, has huge, important national significance. And that was so thrilling, because I love Idaho. Like, no matter where I go, my heart will always be there. And now I have it in this dissertation, and I get to, like, that's like my love letter to Idaho and to these women and to myself, right? That I got to do this thing that I love for 5 years, and I got paid for it, and I got to write this really cool thing, right? Like, so I feel very fortunate. I feel very lucky. Thank you guys for letting me just talk for an hour straight.
I'm so excited to hear all of this, Skye. I learned so much about Idaho and Sun Valley that I never knew before.
Definitely a lot more appreciation for the history of that area. That's really cool.
Yeah, happy to come back and talk about any of the other ones, any of my other chapters, but the Sun Valley one I think is really fun. And if you haven't been, go this summer. It is beautiful. Everyone there is so friendly. Mm-hmm. My dad and I did some mountain biking there and had the time of our lives. So I definitely recommend going if you haven't. And if you have, you know what I'm talking about. Please continue to go. I hope you learned something. And if you didn't, then you are smarter than me. Like, and I don't even mean that in like I didn't know any of this before I started my research. And so people who visit, they have known this forever, and I like respect that so much. But hopefully you learned something.
Yeah, and get lost in an activity this summer too. Like
seriously.
There's skiing, I think, is amazing because, like, once you get those skis strapped to you, there's nothing anybody else can do. It's up to you and the equipment strapped to your feet in the snow and gravity pulling you down. And
right. And Sun Valley actually is really interesting because here's another rant, and then really we can be done, but I could talk about this all day. But they originally didn't open for summer. They were just open for the winter. But after, I think, the first year, they were like, oh, there's lots of stuff that you can do even in the summer, including skiing. Like, it's so high in elevation, and the resort is like this high elevation level, that some of the snowpack stayed through like May. And so there are actually photographs of women in skis, in shorts, and like tank tops in the snow. So I don't know, with climate change and other things, I don't know how much that still happens, but if it does and you can do spring skiing in May, go do it. And
I have one more question about
like
women working in the 20s and 30s. Did the types of jobs change? That's kind of always been my understanding of that time period about women, entering the workforce and moving from, being seamstress and, kind of home body work, homekeeping work, on a larger scale, and then moving to like actually, large scale wartime manufacture.
Yeah, we can actually trace different types of work all the way back to like the 1830s, 1820s, when young women in the Northeast especially leave their homes and go work at like textile mills in Massachusetts. You start to get a little bit more, industrial jobs, factory jobs. We see women work, especially immigrant and working class women, working in factories in New York City, basically from that time through really even the 1920s. But in terms of like average middle America woman, really starting to see the conversation around the types of work that women do change, I think really starting in the 1890s. I think the 1890s, and there are probably so many historians who are like incorrect, but I think, at least from my perspective in terms of culture, the culture changes in the 1890s. The bicycle changes everything for women, right? Because now they can get places quicker. You are no longer confined just to like your block or the immediate like mile around it. You can go further. You can work in other places of town. Starting at this point, you then start to see the like clerical jobs. I think we see a really big explosion of these like white, they call them pink collar, but like white collar clerical and bookkeeping and typist jobs. And then also in sort of the early 1900s is also when we see a shift away from male, actually I think is even before this, from male educators and teachers to female is when we start to see this as well. But again, this could be earlier. I actually don't know, like, this is another thing I have to study a little bit more thoroughly if I get this published, is this question of women in public versus women in private, and when did that change, and is it as big of a drastic of a change between these decades as we previously think? But yeah, you definitely start to see the clerical jobs, and then with the 40s, only with the 40s are we seeing an explosion of like, okay, yeah, you can do some of this manual labor, but only for the wartime emergency, right? There's still, by World War II, even though there is more of this like intense industrial plane building and riveting and these intense jobs, it is only allowed until the men get home, right? So there's always been kind of a stigma. Wartime emergency puts those things on hold, but I think it takes, obviously, as we know, a lot longer for typically industrial industries to accept women as blue-collar physical laborers.
Women have always been a major contribution, a major factor in the workforce, but it's maybe the types of work.
And we saw, I don't know a ton about this, but I do think we saw similar calls for women to join public workforces during World War I. World War I and World War II are not really that dissimilar in terms of like home front discourse. In terms of like, if women go in public, it should really only be for this wartime emergency, but we will accept that. And so World War I actually is a really important starting point, I think, for my topic. My entire project actually starts in 1916. So, and actually, now that I'm talking through it, this is actually so helpful, because now that I'm talking through it, I can absolutely see how I need to like connect that thread even closer in my own works. It isn't really until the second half of the 19th century that I think we see a more accepted, non-clerical expectation, I guess, for women. All right.
Yeah, thanks, Skye.
Thank you for asking all those questions and listening to me and letting me do this.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. You've been so focused and like devoted to this project for so long. It's been cool to like hear, the different avenues. You're in Hollywood, you're in Sun Valley, you're traveling and doing all this stuff. It's just so cool. I've never known anybody to get a doctorate, to become a doctor, so to kind of live through your experiences, to kind of get what that really took it's been really cool and inspiring.
Oh, thank you so much.
What a great episode. Once again, congratulations. Thank you for a little bit of a sneak peek into all of the work you did to get that PhD.
Thank you. It was hard, and I appreciate your guys' patience because, like I said, literally this podcast's existence coincides like with my entire PhD career. So I'm like grateful to you guys and, Anthony. It was just Anthony and I for the first, 3-4-ish years of this project. And so thank you for your patience and all of your hard work as I've been, doing this, doing the podcast kind of on the side. But it's been so great. And I'm just like grateful to be a part of it and to have this platform to like talk about my research.
Yeah. So yeah. Thank you, listeners, for being the people that we can do this to.
Seriously.
And we love you and appreciate you. All right. Well, dang, nice job, Skye, and nice work, Sam. Thanks for setting this all up. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Do your own time.
Do your own number.
And go visit Sun Valley.
Ah, nice. If no one said that, I was going to say that. Nice job.
All right, we'll see you on the slopes, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.